Well, you guys know about giving. Trust me. All right, here we go. If you don't, go to vcclife.org. So, more than just nice. We've been talking in this series of, what that means. The thing about it is, as I thought about, the amounts of interactions that we have, there's a lot of words that we have, right? And in those places and words, there's these places where we can choose to have words of life. That God says we can speak things, and as we speak what is true, God comes in and does huge things. It's funny, it doesn't even have to be that big of a sentence, or it doesn't have to even be say much. I was going through McDonald's the other morning, and usually this McDonald's like you, they're tremendously grumpy. I feel like I'm ministering to them as I go through. Can't I just give you a couple extra bucks just to cheer you up? But I get in this McDonald's, and this guy was so nice. And I noticed about an hour later how much better I felt, and I realized it was because of his tone of voice and a couple of things he said. And I thought, I think he actually meant them. I could feel it, right? That is the words of life. A few weeks back, Caleb was talking, and then he put me and Debbie on the spot and started saying these really nice, beyond nice, very true, but very hard things to take. And I was pushing them away and trying to say they weren't true in my heart. I'm just sitting there. I was just the most uncomfortable as I could be. And I felt like God said, listen. And I could feel God speaking to me and encouraging me as I was very awkwardly trying to receive something that was true. And it changed my day, and it's been something that's affected me since that day. I think back on it. I remember as a child in third grade, I had you don't know this, I should have done an art project for you, Danielle, because I should have brought this one in, actually. When I was in third grade, I created this art project. I got so into it. I used every kind of piece of junk and created a whole scene with all kinds of objects. And I felt so good about it, and then I put it on the wall. But what was so cool is when I was at the open house they had on the wall, and without me knowing, the teacher and my parents were talking, I happened to walk on them, and they were just telling me what an amazing Picasso I was. And this is amazing. This is so good. Why do I remember that from third grade? Because they were speaking things of truth, of words of life, and it just affected me. Just those simple words. I think it's, but I've also had words of life that didn't feel so warm at first, right? One time in our church is, I would be like, I had these meetings I used to go to, and I would just be so frustrated because they weren't understanding what I was saying. And so then I would just say it over and over again different ways, and they would all stare at me, and I would feel like angry at them because they weren't getting what I was saying. And then someone pulled me aside and said, David, we actually do get what you're saying. We just disagree with you. Those are words of life. I really thought they weren't getting what I was saying. And I wasn't, they could feel my thing, so they just kind of pulled back. But them telling me, it changed everything. But it stung a little bit at first, right? But they were words of life. But the thing about words, too, is, do you understand? You can choose to speak words, or you can choose to restrain words. And do you understand that some of the most loving things you can do at times is to restrain words? But there's also times that you have words you could say that you don't say. When I was, I love my parents, by the way. They're amazing parents. I'm so grateful for my parents. My parents were so loving to me. But what I found is that one time I remember I was in the Bay Area, and I was at the Vineyard Church I was at first. It's my first sermon ever, right? Back then they had cassettes. You guys don't know what that is, but it's these things you put in a machine. And so I sent them a cassette, and it felt really vulnerable, right? Because, people were saying good things, being encouraging the church, and thought maybe I'll send that out. I don't remember any comments on it, no response. And I remember thinking, man, I could have used some words that were unspoken. I still, I just, and it's still to this day, it has a little bit of effect on me, and God's used it and all that for how He's shown me what He thinks, well, that. But unspoken words, is very, very different. But I've also had times where unspoken words have been like, as a pastor, I've been doing this for 26, 27 years in this church, and there's been numbers of times that I have people that I'm extremely close to and friends and been involved in their life, and all of a sudden, I can tell they're not as connected to me. I'm not sure what's going on. They haven't said anything, and eventually sometimes they leave the church, and sometimes I even ask them, hey, how are we doing or whatever, and so then what happens oftentimes, and no, I shouldn't say often, but numbers of times, I've had people who are still in the church, who haven't left the church, years later, sometimes months, sometimes years later, say, I was talking to so-and-so, and I'm so glad that conflict didn't, I'm so sad that conflict didn't work out, And I didn't know how I had hurt them. I actually had hurt them and legitimately had hurt them or done something or said something that it really caused them to be really hurt. And then I'm realizing I didn't know about it, right? It's just but I don't at all think those people were vicious or mean. I don't even knew they loved me. I just know they were trying to be nice. But it wasn't nice. It was really hard. Now, so there's these places where, and you guys know that, right? I'm a pastor. I've talked to people. I've had phrases that a parent has said to you and has changed your life, or you've had to work through a lot of things because of words. So these words that we say or don't say can be difficult. But then there's these places that, can be just harmful, right? I asked Debbie permission to share this. She's younger. She went on a trip. We'll call this friend of hers Jane. No offense, Jane, wasn't you. So she went on this trip with Jane, and Jane had a close friend that lived out of town on the way to where they were going, and so they spent the night, right? And they had this, they were young, and they all sleep in the same room. And Debbie fell asleep early, and Jane and her old friend were just talking. And Debbie just happened to wake up. It just kind of kept her eyes closed, but happened to wake up, and she heard them talking, and Jane was describing everything that she disliked about Debbie. And Debbie laid there, kind of taking that in, It's like we can have words that really bring harm. We can have words that are unspoken that should be unspoken and bring life. We can have words that are unspoken that should have been spoken that could have brought more life. But we want to be people who learn how to speak these words that bring life. So, as we look at these areas, and this is really what we're going to be happening, is over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be speaking about our words. This week and next week. It could be a whole series. We're trying to narrow it down a little bit here. But we're going to be speaking about it. And we have this amazing gift that God's given us, is that we have these tones that come out of our mouth that can transform people's lives. But also, as we can see, if we say the wrong things, they can bring damage to other people's lives. It's this place that we want to just understand we have this ability to express the love of God, as Tim talked about, the grace of God through our words, not just our actions, but through our words. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. We all know that's wrong, very clearly. But we have a tendency of devaluing words, that we're talking about, they were just talking. They're just blowing off some hot air, actions speak louder than words. Those are all some truths in those things. But what it shows you is we kind of minimize words. And sometimes it diminishes and disconnects our words from who we are. It's really easy for people to say, I was just talking, as if it wasn't part of them. But our words are part of us. They're an expression of who we are. It shows it's coming from who we are when we speak any words. And so what we look at is we are just this live stream of actions and words. I mean, and in that spot, we can bring the life of God, or we can bring things that harm. And this applies to every person here. Now, I talk more than most of you, Bill talks a little more than I do, but just teasing Bill. Bill listens to me a lot more than I listen to him. But I talk a lot, right? It applies to me, but it applies to all you too, right? Because then I just have more to decide what to restrain or say, and some of you people who don't speak much, maybe there's some unspoken words you need to speak, and all those kind of things, but this applies to everybody. This is not for a few of us. There's no one in this room that doesn't have this battle of trying to figure out what to say and not to say in a situation. Do you guys know what I mean? What do you say, what didn't you say? I mean, it's just like every day of our life, in almost every situation, what do we say and what should we hold back? In James it says, and I'd encourage you to read James 3, but it talks about the tongue, and most of us, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it has this power. But it's like, to hold it back is hard, but if you can actually have God get control of your tongue, it can do these amazing things and bring life to all kinds of people. But there's a struggle in doing it, and all of us understand the struggle. Now, we've been saying over this year, if we're following Jesus, it takes effort. But the effort isn't an effort of determination or willpower and human effort and striving and our human effort for moral standards. The effort is, here's the effort. If you're a newer Christian or you've been a Christian for years, or you're thinking about becoming a Christian, the effort is yielding. It's yielding your will and yourself to Jesus and allowing Him to be the one who directs you and leads you and is the source of how you live. And that's where the effort is. And when we yield ourselves to Jesus, we're yielding our tongues and our words to Jesus. And we need Him to help us to know how to speak life and not to speak harm. We've received this, as Tim talked about, we've received this grace that we get to have it embodied, and we go it to be around people, and as we speak and interact with them, they experience the favor of God. Now, if you could just imagine how that would look as you just are in your relationships with each other, and you just have a spot where you start building one another up every chance you get with your words. They begin speaking truth in places that bring things to light to allow God to work. All right? So the thing is, we have a lot to work with. This is the best guess. If you don't like this answer, AI is the problem. But about 57,000 words are received every day. You can look at those of where they come from. Because words aren't just what we say, they're what we text, how we have posts on social media. And that's how we receive, but then we express around 12,000 words. Stephen Schulte a little less. But 8,000 spoken words, 3,000 words in text and emails. I thought there was a lot. I kept checking, and about 1,000. I don't think I post that much, but someone does. It averages out. But to think about that, in all those 12,000, we have two things. We have potential to do amazing things with those 12,000 words, right? So, what we're going to be talking about today in our words is speaking and not speaking. How do you know when to speak, right? And how do you know when to restrain speaking? And we have the story of Joseph, and we're going to just read this Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. And with Joseph there, he didn't worry about anything except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was very handsome and well-built young man. And Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come sleep with me," she demanded. But he refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held me back nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How could you do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting the pressure on Joseph every day, day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around, and when he went into his work, she came and grabbed him by his cloak, demanding, "Come sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away, but he was left with the cloak in his hands as he ran from the house. And when she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants. Soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here and to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. And when they heard me scream, they ran outside and he got away. But he left the cloak behind, and she kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him the story. The Hebrew slaves you've brought into our house tried to come in and fool around with me," she said, "but I screamed, and he ran outside, leaving his cloak with me." Potiphar was furious, and he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Now, what we see then there is, again, a lot of words. But I want you to look and pay attention as we kind of notice a few things about these words. Notice that there's a lot going on here. So inside these two, there's probably a lot going on. Joseph is human. This gal's probably pretty good looking. She keeps pulling him in. There's probably a lot of things happening down inside of him. And she has a lot of stuff going on inside of her. But she speaks out, "Come sleep with me." Do you understand? This is a distinctive change when she says these words out of her mouth. But then you notice what he basically says back to her is basically, "You're crazy." And he speaks about, "My master's held nothing back to you." And he says, "How could you do such a wicked thing?" He's speaking to the high power and says, "How could you do such a wicked thing?" He says, "No." And he continues to say no. And finally, it gets to a place that she says it again. And then we look at the words again. And then she does this thing. She lies twice to the servants and repeats it again to her husband. Now, a couple things I'd like you to notice about some of these things. First off, notice there's a lot going on in their hearts of both of them. And they're both having to decide what they say and what they don't say, because that's very different than thinking these things. And once you say it, things happen. And I want you also to notice that the damage that a lie can bring. The damage of speaking what is not true had huge implications for Joseph. He lost everything and was put into prison on a lie. One interesting thing to notice in this place is notice that Joseph, who actually gets gold stars on this one, spoke exactly what was true. And yet, that didn't guarantee him great circumstances, right? He paid a huge price for speaking what was true. So what we say, what we choose not to say, is super important. And as followers of Jesus, and as we've connected to God and we've connected to one another, there's a huge emphasis in Scripture about how it is that we become, when we come to Jesus, we actually become connected to Jesus as our head, and we become the family. But we also, another word is that we become his body, where it means that each one of us uniquely has a place that we play, and we're all connected and we're a part of one another, and that's our context of what we are as followers of Jesus. So do you understand how we speak to one another has huge emphasis on how we do as a church? And so, I mean, I have a carpal tunnel something or there, and it just hurts sometimes. And so what happens is it hurts, and then my other hand goes, ooh. And then my other hand looks at it and goes, I can do this for you. I mean, it's just my whole body, because we're all part of my thing. But I don't go, I'm not going to do that for you over here, carpal tunnel. I'm doing my own. No, I'm a part of this. And so I like, that feels good. Thank you. I'll do some work over here. You know what I'm saying? We can just take that analogy and understand the way that we're honestly true seeing and talking is huge because we're all a part of one another. You guys ever had a really bad splinter? Isn't that wild that you can have a bad splinter and you don't? I had this one that was all kind of like really bad back in my other hand. I didn't notice it, didn't feel it, but my eyes saw it. My eyes saw what I was blind to, right? And it was all infected. Then my other hand said, we're going to get that splinter out. And my other hand said, oh, I'm not sure about that. No, they said, okay. And we weren't together, but it wasn't easy. But they saw the truth that this was this was infection. And so I was able, my teeth helped me gritting, and then I just dug out that splinter. And some of you are like splinter people, like, oh. So I dug out that splinter, and it hurt. Really hurt when I did it. I didn't even know it was a problem, but because I allowed the rest of the body to come and say, you got a problem on your hand, and begin helping me, it got to cleared it out, and health came to my body. It was life-giving, right? And that's what we are as a body. And our words are a really big part of this. Now, in Ephesians 4, and this would be a verse you might want to just put in your devotions this week, just read over Ephesians 4. We're not going to cover much of it, but a few verses, but I do want to put it in the context. He's writing to the Ephesians, and he's talking to them. He says, I want to urge you to live a life really to what you've been called to, and I want you to be gentle and humble, and I want you to be bearing with one another and loving one another and make every effort of unity in the Spirit. So he just keeps saying, I want you to do well with one another. And then he goes into this place and he says, you're one body and one Spirit, and you are called together, and then there's one Lord, there's one baptism. And so he starts out that way, and then he begins explaining how this happened through what Christ has done, and now we actually have this ability to be one another, to be a part of one another. And then as he goes on, he talks about this place of being equipped so the body may be built up and reach all unity of faith and knowledge of the Son of God and mature and obtain the full measure of God. And said, you're no longer infants and that have to be blown here and there and have deceit. That's not what you're about. You need to put on this new nature you have. And here's how it starts. He says this in 15. He says, instead of that, speaking the truth in love, you will grow and become, in every respect, the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love, as each part does its work. Continues on, he's explaining that as he goes down, and he talks about, we lived in a former way of life, like the world lived, but we're the church now. We live in a whole different way of life, and we don't live like we used to, and so we need to live in a whole new way. And he says this, but put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Therefore, you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we're all members of one body. All right. So, speaking the truth, what does it look like? What does speaking the truth look like in love? What does that mean, to put off falsehood? We talked about in our last series in John, we talked about this place. This is, if we claim to have fellowship with him yet walk in darkness, we lie and the truth is not in us. But if we walk in the light as he is like, we have fellowship with one another. And the blood of Jesus cleanses us and purifies from all sin. As we went through 1 John, it's like we have to live in truth. We have to live in honesty with one another. In fact, that is the very thing that purifies us and allows us to experience God. Now, sometimes what we do, though, is we have a tendency of lying. Now, we don't lie like maybe Potiphar's wife. But the thing is there's a continuum here. The truth is the truth. When we say things that aren't true, it never helps one another, right? And so sometimes we just, think, well, I just want to be nice. But nice is not what it's talking about here. It's not just surviving along. It's a place that we're entering into a place that we actually become deeply connected and have life come into it, and we're able to see with new eyes and function completely different ways because we are connected to one another. And, I think I should have asked Emily McCall if I could share this, but she looks really good in these examples, so I think it's okay. All right. But Emily McCall, she has been one of the best people of speaking truth in love to me, right? She just really has modeled it to me over our long, mini-talking relationship, right? And, Emily and I, you combine our words, it's a lot, right? And, so anyway, I think sometimes with Emily is that recently, during a service, she plopped down beside Debbie and I, very vulnerable, very emotional, and began expressing things that she loved about us. And I was in my mind thinking about all the things that she shouldn't love about me, but she kept saying them, and it just affected me tremendously. It affected Debbie tremendously. It just was a great morning because of that, right? And so she spoke the truth, and I could just instantly know it wasn't flattery. She was actually saying it from her heart. You know that feeling when someone says something and you can tell it's not flattery? That they're saying it from their heart, and you can know it's not just them, it's truth that God is wanting you to know and take in. And so she did really good at that. But there's, with Emily, like I said, she was imparting grace at that moment. God's love and his grace that I did not deserve, and it was hard to take in, but she's imparting that. But we've also been in lots of meetings together. The proverb comes to mind, when there are many words, sin is unavoidable. But he who restrains their lips is wise. Sometimes we didn't quite know how to do those two things very well. So we've had times, and I would oftentimes, after a meeting, maybe Emily would call me, and sometimes, clueless of this happening, but she would say, David, in that one conversation, I really said something that was disrespectful, and I just want to say I'm sorry. And you know what I wanted to do? And sometimes I was already kind of knocked out for a few hours because of that meeting. And she called me, and I wanted to say, don't worry about it. It didn't affect me much. But I was able to say, man, that helps. I was not doing well. And I was able to take it in, and it changed, and all of a sudden, me and Emily had this connection to another degree of life And I was able to then see things inside of me that I couldn't see just by this conversation. But I've had other times where Emily has called me. I have a few times I've done it away, but I think Emily may be on the higher side. But Emily called me and said, you know, when you said that, it wiped me out. And then when she says that to me, I'm on the other end, I think, I feel sad, but sometimes I have reaction. Like, whoa, but, and all these things start going on, but I realized that she was saying something that was true. And in that process, way more happened than us just getting it settled. It opened us up into one another's life where these new things could start happening that I couldn't have got to before. You know what I mean? Very different. And all of a sudden, that was just, it felt a little hurt. Kind of like, Tim said last week, I love that. He said, sometimes hurt doesn't mean harm. It hurts, but it brings life. So those conversations have been huge in how it's affected my life. Now, so this place but she was in, that moment when she was doing that and saying, David, this way, it was an impartation of grace to me, right? They were both impartations of grace. So, affirming words, and all those particular things as far as it's this place of affirming words. It's vulnerable. It is hard sometimes to take because it's grace. And it's undeserved. But it allows you, as in those interactions, it helped me understand more of who God was as well and how he saw me. All right. So both are impartations of grace. Now, grace is speaking the truth in love. What does it look like in real life? There's a few examples, but let's give a few more of how that might look. First off, so what I want to do is now, I want to help you have some ideas of when, because you have plenty of opportunities. You have 12,000 opportunities a day to do something really amazing, all right? All these words you're having and practicing, how do you start actually moving towards this place of speaking words of life and speaking the truth in love? The first off, I would say again, emphasizing the effort is yielding the Holy Spirit. That's what you pay attention to. It's not like, did I say this right? Do I this right? It's really a matter of when you're doing this, you're saying, God, I need to yield to what you're asking me. And so this is really key. If you're wanting to get better about having words of life, understand that the effort is not justifying thinking how to perfectly say it right, how to make yourself. It's all the opposite of that. It's a matter of really humbling yourself and actually yielding yourself to the Holy Spirit. And I also say is we learn by doing. What I'm saying is you're not going to do it well a lot. You are going to, let's say, for instance, you try, I'm going to do this really good, and you go home and you get in this massive fight with a friend, your roommate, or your spouse. And they go, forget this, right? Well, that's just more opportunities, because now you can take your words and let God show you what to do with that. So understand it will not look like a straight line, and you only can start learning to do this when you start intentionally practicing. And our life goal is to increase more and more speaking the truth in love. And it never ends. It's not like, I've got this down right now. It's always a spot that we have more that God wants to do. And this is, everybody in this room, it will be a lifetime venture to speak the truth in love more and more. And so how do we know when we're to say something and to not say something? How do we know when to stay silent? Practice building community with one another with our words is a lifestyle. Remember that is an expression of grace and truth and in love and not speaking what brings harm. So just understand that this is something that you can practice as a lifestyle. What I mean by that, you can do it when you get into conflict with your spouse today or your kids or your friend today. That's a great opportunity to practice. But you can practice when you're doing really well. You can be thinking, what words could I say that would bring life? What truth can I say in love in the situation? So practice this as a lifestyle and understand this is an expression of grace. and listen to God and beware of what's going on in your heart. And when you're in these places, like, how do you know what to say and what not to say? And I can't give you a complete formula to this, but I can give you some help in understanding that you need to pay attention when you listen to Jesus. You want to ask this question: why do I want to be silent at this point? And the other question you have is, why do I want to speak at this point? And that will help you. You know, it's like if you can imagine having some kids downstairs that did this amazing thing downstairs in the kids zone, and you think, I'm going to tell them that, right? Why are you thinking that? Probably not for yourself, right? Or I'm going to tell the parents how cool that kid is. But sometimes we even resist saying that. We just kind of let it go. No, when you have those moments, you know, hey, that's not for me, that's for them. I can say that. I have green light when that happens, right? But there's other places in which there's other times that you're in the church and maybe there's a spot where, someone's hurt you. Does that ever happen here? No. So you get hurt by one another. That's what we do as humans, right? We're hurt by a person. Or they've hurt us, we've hurt them, and we have to decide, what do I do with that? So what you have to think about is, like, when you've done that, is you're kind of aware that I should do something about that. But when you say, should I speak or not speak, maybe you have to pray about that. So, like, say, all of a sudden, Bobby does something really terrible. I'm so used to that from him. But Bobby does something terrible to me, and I'm like, I think right now, as I'm thinking, should I speak right now or should I not? I might think, why would I speak? Because I want to get Bobby back, or I feel like I was misrepresented, or I feel like you didn't, and all kinds of things come up, right? So I think, probably not a good time to speak, but probably not a good time to stay silent forever. But you probably need to get away and be going saying, what can I say and how can I say it, right? Other times we don't speak because we're silent, and we don't speak because we are afraid that somehow, I'm conflict avoidant. I just don't like conflict. So just be nice and be quiet. That's not being nice. Sometimes we don't speak because it's just easier to be silent, or we fear rejection, or we want to please this person. We say that's going to break our relationship, and we're afraid of that, so we just don't say anything. But then there's this problem that happens. Those things that aren't spoken, that should be spoken, are still in us, and they turn to other things that aren't good. And there's this thing called a root of bitterness that grows, even though we don't know it. And all of a sudden, I don't enjoy sitting by that person as much. And I don't really care that much. But I'm kind, I'm nice to them. But you'll find yourself having less and less capacity to love because of these things that happen over time. So it's real important we begin recognizing that God wants to teach us when to say something and when to not. Invitation, as we're coming up and get ready. I really would encourage you for today, right now, don't wait on this. You can, during the worship time, during the prayer time, is there anyone that God is highlighting to you that you should speak to? It could be for a lot of things. It could be encouragement, it could be an issue, is there anybody that he's highlighting to speak to? And what I want you to do is say, yes, I will speak to them. Maybe you can speak to them today, and if you can't speak to them today, you've already committed to God, I will speak to them, all right? For this week, just ask God to make you aware of your words. Your words will show you what's in your heart. Pay attention to what you're saying and listen to your tone so God can talk to you about your words, and then be looking for opportunities that you can actually speak truth in love.